5 realizations that will make you a better musician. I'm Tobiah Murphy, and this is Murphy Music Academy. Realization number 1. You actually have no idea what you want your music to sound like before you start practicing it. Now, you may say, but I do know what I want it to sound like before I start practicing it. That's why I've been listening to so many recordings. And no. If listening to recordings is all that you're doing to develop your concept of an interpretation, then you're not actually figuring out what you want it to sound like. What you're really doing is just figuring out what you don't want it to sound like. And most people's practicing is like this. They are just reacting to things that they don't like in their playing without really figuring out exactly what they're trying to do before they even start practicing. And of course, there are an infinite number of ways to do something wrong, and I don't know, maybe 5 to 10 ways to do it correctly. And before you start practicing, you need to start figuring out exactly which one of those 5 to 10 ways of doing something correctly, and yes, that is an arbitrary number, but you get my point, which one of those ways of doing something correctly you want to be working towards. Now, this, of course, is something that should be applied to all musicians and instrumentalists, but as you probably know, I'm a violinist, so let's talk about some violin music and how to apply it there. Let's look at the Bach E major violin partita, the Gavotte and Rondo movement, very famous movement, some of you might recognize. Anyway, there's a lot to think about when you start practicing this because everyone plays this a different way. When I start practicing this, I'm not just trying to learn the notes, even though that's of course what I'm trying to do, and I need to make sure that they're in tune and all of that. But I'm also wanting to think about my tempo. Some people play this with a little bit more of a slower, maybe more regal tempo, with maybe a little bit wider sort of burst in the sound. Some people might play this a lot more light and quickly. I kind of like to tend to keep it a little bit more in the middle. And then, of course, you have to decide, okay, how long do I want my notes to be? For instance, if I'm going to play at my quicker tempo, I might be having a little bit lighter touch to the bow. I might be having a little bit quicker drop off to some of the notes, a little bit more space between the notes maybe. Somebody playing it slower may decide that they want that. They might want things a little bit thicker, maybe a little bit less space between the notes. And then, of course, something like the chords at the end, you know. I like to lift off at the end of every chord group. You know, somebody might want to make that a little bit more even. Whatever you decide to do, this is something that you need to figure out before you even start practicing it, right? Decide kind of how long you want each of those notes to be. Decide how much of a space or breathing room you're going to put between the music, and of course decide what tempo you want the music to go at. These are all things that you should be thinking about before you even start practicing it. You should be getting your music out, you should be going through it, you should listen to a recording, of course, not to copy somebody else, but to kind of get an idea of what the piece sounds like and get a feel for it, but then go through and for every single note and every single passage, start developing a general idea of what you want the music to sound like. The thing about this approach is, of course, you are not going to end up with the exact ideas that you started with. You're going to develop those ideas as you're practicing. But if you don't start with a concrete goal that you're working towards, and it's just this very nebulous, I don't like what I did, I'm going to do something different, your practice is not going to be anywhere near as productive, and you are not going to develop as well as a musician. Realization number 2. You're ignoring the basic technical rules of your instrument. Now, as a violinist, I of course can only, again, demonstrate with violin, but my grandmother was a pianist and I've heard her complain about her own students enough to know that this applies to everyone no matter what instrument they play. For example, I probably have to remind a student to follow the proper shifting technique that I've taught them at least once a week, if not more. Now, the shifting technique has not changed since I first taught the student how to shift. Yet, whether they're playing their very first shifting pieces in Suzuki Book 4 or a Mozart concerto, very often I still have to remind them of the basic shifting technique which fixes their problem, which can't help but have me wondering, what if you just took the information that I've already provided for you and made sure that you're following it all the time? But then again, of course, I did the exact same thing as a student, so I really can't get that upset. But the fact remains that all musical instruments have their own basic technical rules that, if students make sure they are studiously following them, are going to fix a lot more problems on their own, which means they're going to learn faster, which means they are going to become much better musicians sooner. Of course, if you don't actually know what the basic rules of technique are in violin, viola, or piano, then you need to go over to murphymusicacademy.org to set up your first free trial lesson with one of our highly qualified private teachers who will get you started on the right path so you can start practicing correctly. Realization number 3. You always make the same mistakes. Mistakes are actually incredibly predictable. We tend to make the exact same mistakes in the exact same way, often in the exact same part of the music every single time. I can't tell you how many times I've had somebody repeat a section of music because they made a mistake, which I pointed out, which they acknowledged, for them to make the exact same mistake a second or third time. Your mistakes are incredibly predictable, and unless you make a point to, before you get to that same part where you last made the mistake, to counteract whatever caused that mistake. If you play something flat, make sure that that note you play it quite sharp. Unless you do that, you are going to make the same mistake in the same spot every single time. Having this attitude should revolutionize your practice because now you can come up with something of a plan. You make this one mistake, okay, maybe it's going to be a random occurrence, maybe it's predictable. You make it twice, it's definitely going to happen a third time. You make it a third time, well, you really want to buckle down on that spot because you are going to do it again. But knowing exactly where your mistakes are going to be should give you a very clear idea of how you need to practice and what you should be thinking about while you're playing. All it takes is for you to, while you're playing through a piece or passage, make a catalog of where your mistakes are or where they tended to be, and then as you go through it again, try to fix them before you get there. For example, I'm going to take a little bit of Preludium and Allegro because I haven't played it for over 10 years and I'm sure I'll make mistakes on it. So just looking at this little passage here, okay, I'm going to be super picky. That note was a bit off. A little bit sharp there. That note was a little bit sharp. Now that's one that I definitely would be more likely to miss. Very, very flat. So what I would want to do is go through it the next time, remembering those notes that I was a little bit sharp on, or definitely the one I was very flat on, and try to shift my finger a little bit more in each way. Especially that last one. There we go. I would have missed that again if I wasn't thinking about it. And you will too. Actually, to be fair, I could probably have played that note even a little bit higher and it would have been better, so I'm going to need to play through this with that mindset a few more times. Realization number 4. You should be memorizing your music as soon as possible. Something I like to tell all of my students is that your number one priority when you start learning a piece of music is being able to get from one end of the piece to the other without stopping. The second priority is to do that without looking at the music. This surprises a lot of people when I first tell them because they often think, well, the number one goal I should have is to make sure all the notes are in tune or to be able to play everything correctly. But you want to be able to make the first thing you're doing when learning a piece of music to be able to get through it and then to be able to get through it without looking at the sheet music, and I'll tell you why. If you don't make a point right away to be able to play through the entire thing and effectively have as much music learned as quickly as possible, then you don't really have that much to actually work on in either your practice or your lessons. How many times have you experienced this where you're thinking that, oh, I need to make sure that all of these notes are right, and then you bring 3 lines of music to your teacher? It's happened to me very, very many times, which is why I make sure that all my students follow this as a rule. Once you're able to play through one end of the piece to the other, even if it's not perfect, well, then we have an idea of the whole piece right off the bat, and there's a lot more that I can then help you perfect and help you work on in your practice and in our lessons. The same principle applies to memorization. If you can play any piece of music from one end to the other from memory, then it doesn't matter if it's perfect, it doesn't matter if everything is 100% right, it doesn't matter if you don't have it up to tempo. Those are all things that you can now work on with a lot more freedom because you don't have to worry about what note comes next. You can think about your intonation because you don't have to worry about whether you're playing a B or a B flat next. You already know, so you can start to tune whichever one of those notes it is. So if you really want to take your musicianship to the next level, start memorizing your pieces as soon as you start learning them. Now, for the 5th and final realization that will make you a better musician, technique is actually a lot simpler than you realize. Now, this is an idea that I've talked a lot about on this channel specific to violin technique, but almost everything you're doing, if you're doing it correctly, should be done in the simplest way possible, and sometimes all it takes is for us to just realize that. For instance, there's this one exercise that I put almost all of my usually beginning students through, written by this fellow right here, Otakar Shevchik, which is very, very basic left-hand exercises that are excellent for anyone that wants to end up with very good left-hand technique. And basically, you just take groups of 4 or 3 notes, and they're repeated in various patterns at various speeds. One of them, if you look at this one, just take those notes and do them a little faster. I've had that exercise get a lot of people messed up in their hand. Their fingers get tight or tense. And I have to tell them, you realize that your fingers actually, despite what you might be hearing, they're not actually moving that fast. They're moving half that fast. Because I'm holding one finger down, and my other 2 fingers are going 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That's how fast the fingers are actually moving. But if I let the first finger stick in between them, then it sounds a lot faster than your fingers actually have to move. And sometimes we just need to take a quick look at our technique this way for things to suddenly not be as difficult as we thought they were. For a slightly more advanced example, let's take this bit from the beginning of the Rondo from the Hafner Suite by Mozart. Now, not the most difficult thing in the world, but not very easy either, especially the... right? So, what if, instead of just working at that like that, I instead put my bow down and just played it like this? It looks a lot simpler, right? And sometimes when we remove just half the equation and we just play with our left hand, or in other cases, sometimes if there's a difficult bowing thing, we just play with our right hand, suddenly we realize that our fingers maybe aren't moving as fast as we felt they were when we were, even though we're still doing it at the same tempo, and the motions we're taking often tend to be a lot simpler and a lot more direct because we're not really worried about anything else besides what our fingers are doing. And then when we pick our bow back up, we can try to play it with that same simplicity that was revealed when we put the bow down. Learn to search for the simplicity in your technique and your playing, and you will find yourself having such an easier time making music, and you will become such a better musician from it. Anyway, these are 5 realizations that have made me a better musician, will make you a better musician, and hopefully will make my students better musicians once they decide to start applying them. You know who you are. Anyway, I've been Tobiah Murphy for Murphy Music Academy, always here to remind you that there is no pleasure in mediocrity. Happy practicing, and I'll see you next time.